If you accept that 1776, the counter-revolution, was a great leap forward for humanity, then you have to accept a certain kind of self-abnegation if you're an African. That is to say, you have to say that it was a great leap forward for our ancestors to be further plunged into slavery. And oftentimes when I am making this point in the classroom, you know, our classes today, even though I haven't taught in 5 years, but from 5 years ago, students are fiddling with their smartphones as you're talking, you know, I guess, you know, watching Rihanna videos and checking basketball scores, etc. And so I'll swoop down and grab their smartphone and say, I've just expropriated your private property without compensation. That's what happened to the enslavers in the South. Now, you're very angry, aren't you? Particularly in the United States, there's a difficulty because of the anti-blackness that seeks to turn every immigrant who comes here against black people as a kind of revenge for our helping to overthrow the insanely profitable slave system. And so therefore the idea is we should be punished for all time. The ruling class, on the one hand, feels it has little to fear from black Americans allying in 2025 with the real and imagined adversaries of the U.S. ruling class. And at the same time, over the past 7 decades or so, there has been a retreat of black internationalism. The left has had so much difficulty gaining traction in this country because what they've sought to do is take a certain kind of left-wing white nationalism and get all of the rest of us to sign on to it, to co-sign it. And then when we don't co-sign it, we're denounced. So what kind of political strategy is that? It's a political strategy that leads to the rise of neo-fascism.
Hi everyone, and welcome back on Amandla, the monthly Pan-African international show on Black Pearl Media Reloaded with our permanent guest, Dr. Gerald Horne. So Dr. Gerald Horne is a historian and longtime political activist in anti-racist, Pan-African, and international struggles. He's the author of at least 50 books on a wide range of critically important issues for the oppressed masses across the globe. His latest books include African Americans and the New History of the USA. I'm going to show them on the screen a while. Right. So African Americans in the New History of the USA, and his latest book that came out a few weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, is titled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800-1865. Gerald Horne is also the permanent host. He's the co-host and host and co-producer of a very important show which airs on KPFK 19.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific and can be found at kpfk.org or on the YouTube channel of the Activist Network. So this is the title of the show, Freedom Now, that people can find on kpfk.org or the YouTube channel of the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne is also the permanent guest of 3 very important shows that are worth mentioning here. The first one being the Horne Report, that people can find on Diasporic Music, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time and replays on the Activist News Network. Around the Horne, which is a weekly international news update on the Activist News Network. And finally, De Facto Podcast with our friend and comrade, Anthony Ballas. Right. And since we are commemorating this year the centenary of Frantz Fanon, who was born in the island of Martinique on July 20th, 1965, I'd also like to remind our audience that Dr. Horne was awarded in 2023 the Frantz Fanon Lifetime Achievement Award by the Caribbean Philosophical Association. So, Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, it's an honor and pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome back on Amandla.
Thank you for inviting me.
Um, so, for those who are joining us for the first time or who have missed the previous episodes, I would just like to remind you that this is the fifth episode of Amandla. We've been covering several books that Dr. Horne has been writing over the decades. So if you go on the YouTube channel of the Black Power Media Reloaded, you'll find the previous episode. So the books that we have covered in previous episode include this one, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader, The Deepest South, the United States, Brazil, and the African Slave Trade, Black and Brown, African Americans and the Mexican Revolution, 1910-1920, The End of Empires, African Americans in India, Race War, White Supremacy and Japanese Attack on British Empire, and finally, Facing the Rising Sun, African Americans, Japan, and the Rise of Afro-Asian Solidarity. So the book that we'd like to discuss today was written almost 25 years ago. It's titled From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965-1980, which is one of the two books that Dr. Horne has written on Southern Africa. The second one being this one, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela. So, Dr. Horne, before delving into the aforementioned book, From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War against Zimbabwe, 1965-1980, I would like to ask you if you could say a few words about your own involvement in the solidarity movement, not only with Zimbabwe, but with the liberation movements in general in Southern Africa, and also your own experience in independent Zimbabwe, where you have spent some time and where you have also conducted some research that led to the publication of the book, very important book that we'll be discussing today.
Well, certainly in 1995, I was posted at the University of Zimbabwe. And I took the time while residing there to do research at the Zimbabwe Archives, which is a marvelous archive, despite the fact that the preceding regime, speaking of the racist Rhodesian regime, ousted from power in 1980, before leaving power, they began to burn documents in a great Holocaust so that their many crimes could not be ascertained. But having said that, it's still fair to say that the archive in Zimbabwe is a marvelous institution. And I recall very well walking from my residence in Zimbabwe on a regular basis to the archive. And just as a footnote, I would walk every day past the residence of Mengistu Haile Mariam. Recall that he was the leader of Ethiopia in the 1970s under the leadership of the Derg, D-E-R-G-U-E. Of course, he and his comrades were eventually overthrown, and he was accepted as an asylum seeker by the ruling party in Zimbabwe because, of course, his regime had been very helpful to the liberation fighters in what was then Rhodesia. In any case, it was a very stimulating experience in Zimbabwe. And I should also mention, to respond further to your question, that from 19, I guess I'm going to reveal that this gray hair is not a dye job. From 1966 to 1970, I lived in the New York metropolitan area. And then again from 1973 to 1988. And during that time, I was heavily involved in the solidarity movement with regard to the sovereignty and independence, not only of Zimbabwe, but of Namibia, South Africa, etc. And in fact, in 1989, a scant year after I had left New York, I went to then apartheid-occupied Namibia just before independence in 1990. I went there as a journalist to do reporting back to the United States about the events there. Just an interesting factoid with regard to that journey. This was a moment of flux, the transition from apartheid rule to SWAPO rule. SWAPO, Southwest African People's Organization, still in power in Windhoek. And so there was a certain amount of fluidity there. And the apartheid rulers, of course, they were trying to curry favor with the United States of America. I've been told that I speak with a U.S. accent. And so whenever I would encounter one of these apartheid minions, I would begin talking, because I noticed that when they encountered people as dark-skinned as myself, they'd ordinarily be disrespectful, to put it euphemistically. And so I decided, well, I'll just start talking and maybe they won't treat me disrespectfully. And it turned out that that particular gambit worked. So in any case, that is part of my experience in the region. And of course, since that time, now worked on that book on Brazil. I traveled to Tanzania. Actually, I traveled to both Dar es Salaam and to Zanzibar, because Zanzibar used to be a major entrepot for the unlimited African slave trade. It was sort of a clearinghouse for enslaved Africans being transported from the interior of Africa, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, etc., even northern Mozambique, into Zanzibar, and then oftentimes being sent around the Horn, sent around the Cape, sent around the Cape to Brazil in particular, because Brazil was the preeminent slave market of that 19th century era, and then oftentimes on to the United States of America. So that's a long-winded introduction as to my involvement in the sub-region of Africa that led to the book now before us.
Thank you for that important reminder, Dr. Horne. So I wanted to start with the origins of the, at least the factors that led to the war, which broke out in 1965 after the regime, the white supremacist regime that was presided by Ian Smith. Just wanted to take a few seconds to show his face on the screen. So Ian Smith in 1965, he's the guy, right? In 1965, he issued a unilateral Declaration of Independence. And regarding the origins of that war, you write in the aforementioned book, The Battle of Again, the United States in the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965-1980, you write, the causes of this war were many, but one that should not be forgotten is the desire of European colonists to maintain their affluent way of life, which was deemed to be threatened by African majority rule. Yet, as the war proceeded, Rhodesian luxury increasingly resembled a gilded jail cell. To maintain their elevated position during the war, the Rhodesians, in some ways, built prisons for themselves. They resided behind high walls and formidable gates. So my first question is based on books that you have written subsequently, including the Counter-Revolution of 1776. I wanted to ask you if the colonization of Rhodesia was a typical example of what you have heard, what you have called class collaboration.
Well, certainly. I mean, what's interesting about today's Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, just north of South Africa, a place that was colonized by British invaders beginning in the 1890s. Compare that to the European invasion of South Africa, which begins in 1652, for example. And so historically, the Rhodesians were outnumbered. And what happens in these settler colonies, and you can see it also in my book on Kenya. Kenya, of course, where I also did research and visited, was colonized more or less the same time. And so what happens is that these settlers are looking to attract other settlers. And so in order to attract other settlers, and this is dimly understood in the United States of America, the preeminent settler state, the heavyweight champion of settler colonialism, they had to offer certain emoluments, certain benefits in order to attract people, because they needed boots on the ground. They needed an enhanced settler population in order to overawe and intimidate the majority. In North America, they had to have a substantial settler population to overawe and intimidate the indigenous population, the Native American population, and then, of course, the enslaved African population. Likewise, in Rhodesia, they had to offer certain benefits in order to attract Europeans. And that is what they proceeded to do. But having said that, at its height, say in 1965, you saw that there were probably only about 250,000 Europeans in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, as opposed to millions and millions and millions of Africans, perhaps 8 or 9 million at that particular moment. What happens, as you know, is that it was a British colony, but by the time the 1960s arise, the momentum for decolonization is picking up speed, particularly in 1960 and 1963. 1963 December, you see the independence of Kenya, for example. And so you see London, the colonizing power, in a sense, recognizing the jig was up. And as in the United States of America, and this is difficult oftentimes for many folks to understand, the settlers were not interested in African majority rule for reasons already adduced on our screen. So they decided to embark on what was called UDI, a Unilateral Declaration of Independence, in November 1965. What happens is that with UDI, you see that the Rhodesian regime is backed to a degree by neighboring South Africa. I say to a degree because there are those in your audience who may be familiar with the pre-existing tensions that have existed between settlers from Great Britain and settlers with roots in Protestant Holland, and also the Huguenots from France, Protestant France. As you know, there's this complicated history of the French Catholics chasing out the Huguenots. And many of them wound up actually at the tip of Africa in post-1652. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that those who only associate settlers in South Africa with Protestant Dutch may be stunned and struck by the proliferation and profusion of French-sounding names, surnames. Duplessis, for example, is a prominent French Huguenot, French Protestant name. And in fact, in the United States of America, I wrote in one of my books, I can't remember which, that I said that the French Huguenots took to slave trading like whales took to water. I mean, there's a cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, which used to be an epicenter of enslavement of Africans and the African slave trade, in fact, where if you walk through the cemetery, just about every tombstone has a French-sounding name because they're French Huguenots and they were major trading slave traders. So in any case, there was tension between the predominantly British settlers of Rhodesia and the so-called Afrikaner settlers of South Africa. And that exploded in the so-called Anglo-Boer War of the late 19th century. And even though the Boers lost, they quickly kissed and made up with the British. And of course, helped to establish apartheid in 1948. And so by the time 1965 rolls around with UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, there's still this relationship between Pretoria and Salisbury, the colonial name of Harare, Zimbabwe. And the regime in Rhodesia would not have lasted as long as it did, having to give up power in 1980, but for the assistance from across the border in apartheid South Africa. And I should also say, but for the assistance they received from US nationals. Because as I point out in the book, it has been estimated that there were thousands of Euro-American mercenaries who flocked to Rhodesia to fight Africans on behalf of racist rule. They are buried there to this very day. Recall that the United States was defeated ignominiously in Vietnam in April 1975. And so that means that you have this very dangerous combustible situation when you have military veterans who are embittered and have just been defeated and they're seeking revenge. I dare say that one of the reasons why the war in Zimbabwe was so bloody and so bitter and so violent was not least because of these Euro-American mercenaries, because they had little history with that country, needless to say. They came with these putrid anti-Black racist ideas that they could then execute on the bodies of Africans, which they proceeded to do. But fortunately, there were liberation movements that arose in Zimbabwe. An initial liberation movement was ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, under the leadership of Joshua Nkomo. Subsequently, there arose another movement, ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, under the leadership of Robert Mugabe, who becomes the first leader of independent Zimbabwe in 1980. There's Nkomo on your screen, and there's Mugabe. And before being ousted in the 21st century, because the United States was very upset with the ruling party because it had moved towards land reform. That is to say, moving to take away a good deal of the land that had been seized illicitly by the invaders beginning in the 1890s. Although, as I point out, a significant percentage of the colonists, the settlers in Zimbabwe arrived post-1945 because Britain was going through hard times after being pummeled from pillar to post by the Germans during World War II, with people sleeping in subways, for example, because of the German blitzkriegs. And so Zimbabwe seemed very inviting at the time. Sunshine. And Zimbabwe, by the way, is a very pleasant place to reside, even now, with the biting of sanctions and the attempt to reduce living standards. It still has some of the most pleasant weather on planet Earth, to be frank with you. And it's a very pleasant place to live. And so you had these settlers flocking there, and that complicated the efforts of the liberation movements. At a certain point, of course, you had a relationship between ZAPU and the African National Congress of South Africa, for example, and you had a relationship between ZANU and, to a degree, the Pan-Africanist Congress, although both had relationships, Pan-African Congress of South Africa, or as they would say, Azania, and to a degree, both had relationships with Frelimo, the liberation movement in Mozambique to the east, which with Frelimo surging to power in the mid-1970s. It's fair to say that a turning point for this entire struggle against racist rule in Rhodesia comes with Angolan independence in 1975, because at that point, the Cubans, in order to foil an invasion of Angola by apartheid South Africa and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, dispatches thousands of troops across the Atlantic, and they administer a real shellacking to these races. And hovering in the atmosphere was the idea that if the Rhodesians did not negotiate in good faith, the Cubans would invade Zimbabwe and oust these people unceremoniously and bodily. And because of that threat hanging in the atmosphere, it was a powerful lever on behalf of the liberation movements. And that's one of the reasons why in 1994, when you had the inauguration of Nelson Mandela in Pretoria, the heartiest and stormiest applause was accorded to Comrade Fidel Castro, because every school child in South Africa could tell you that the liberation of that sub-region was heavily dependent upon the Cubans, which is one of the reasons why you have this blockade and embargo on Cuba to this very day by U.S. imperialism. So that's a thumbnail sketch of some of the forces involved in this struggle. Settlers, mercenaries, liberation movements, Cuban military, contradictions between Pretoria and Salisbury, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Horne, for that incredible background. Actually, you responded to many of the questions that I had for today, but maybe we'll come back to some of them a bit deeper. The role of the mercenaries, you mentioned it, and also the turning points for the liberation of Angola with Cuban support, and also the downfall of the dictatorial regime in Portugal in 1974. But we'll come back to that in our subsequent questions. I wanted to discuss now, I wanted to turn to the role of the US. So when I say the US, I mean both the governments, okay, from Lyndon B. Johnson to Ronald Reagan. I guess he was the last president before the regime was ousted in Harare. But I also want to discuss the role that US public opinion also played, and also US corporate interests. So the role that these three actors played in contributing to the war effort of the Rhodesians. So in the book you write, and I quote, many from the US South viewed Rhodesia's UDI as a latter-day version of their own attempt to secure independence a century earlier, which helps to explain why Rhodesia's cause found such a willing support in this region of the United States. Many in the US viewed the Rhodesian experience through their own historical lens and simply could not understand why it was legitimate for Europeans to expropriate the indigenous in North America, but not in Southern Africa, and why anti-communism could not justify helping Salisbury as the 21st century approach. And finally, regarding the policies of the US administration, you wrote, the Nixon administration, which had pursued a Southern strategy, capitalized on fears of Euro-American voters about racial desegregation, complemented that policy by cozying up to Rhodesia in what might be called a Southern Africa strategy, in both cases, deflecting the aspirations of Blacks was the priority. So I wondered if you could elaborate on how these three factors, white supremacy, these three ingredients, white supremacy, anti-communism, and the erosion of Jim Crow during the Cold War influenced the attitudes of US public opinion and the successive governments, Democrats and Republicans, toward Rhodesia during that war.
Well, first of all, you have to understand the US context. That is to say, after the end of World War II, 1945, the United States was under unremitting pressure to do something about its own apartheid system. This was for many reasons. One, the apartheid system carried an eerie resemblance to the racism of the recently defeated Nazi regime, as is well known, as historians have pointed out. The Nazis studied Jim Crow in order to formulate a legal regime that would help to execute persecution and bigotry, for example. At the same time, August 1945 also marks the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic weapons. And as I pointed out in my books on Japan, it's not accidental that this Asian country was subjected to atomic weaponry, not only because of racism, but also because Tokyo had made a conscious appeal to Black Americans. And that was touching upon the Achilles heel of the US system, for example. And so a lesson had to be sent that no other nation should try that. That is to say, don't try to make a special appeal to Black Americans, otherwise you'll be bombed into smithereens. This happened in Hiroshima Nagasaki. So this sets the stage for the agonizing retreat of Jim Crow or US apartheid. And what happens is that this allows more Black people in the United States to vote. It allows more Black people in the United States to raise their incomes. And by the way, in 2025, the bargain that led to that retreat is now under threat by the tangerine tyrant, speaking of Mr. Trump. And you have a rather stunning and startling reversal of fortune in the last 7 to 8 months since Mr. Trump was inaugurated in January 2025, seeking to reverse all of those gains with regard to voting rights, with regard to income, with regard to employment. And we have yet to hit the bottom. And it's unclear what the bottom will look like. But in any case, to return to the major thread, what happens is that, sadly enough, part of the bargain with regard to these reforms was tossing overboard the internationalists amongst us, the late, great Paul Robeson in the first instance, Hollywood star, concert singer, linguist, and socialist. And that helped to damage the internationalism of the Black American community, but it did not damage it altogether, because when UDI rolls around in November 1965, there's still a complement of internationalism, the legacy of Robeson, who, by the way, doesn't die until 1975. And so this leads to a strong and striking solidarity movement. And this has a lot to do with personal relationships, because when I was in New York, there were many Zimbabwean students who were matriculating there at the time. And we bonded on many different levels, for example, on the political level, the personal level, et cetera. And then at the same time, to return to the essence of your question, there was a certain kind of bonding between Europeans on both sides of the Atlantic. I point out in the book that President Johnson, the US president from 1963 to 1969, had relatives in Rhodesia. Ian Smith, whose picture you just showed on the screen, the leader of the rebellious regime, had relatives in Southern California. Nancy Kissinger, the spouse of Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State, had relatives in Rhodesia, for example. So there were ties of singular intimacy between Europeans on both sides of the Atlantic and Africans on the both sides of the Atlantic. Although, of course, those sorts of familial ties were not necessarily present amongst Africans. It was more or less political ties and personal ties. And so what happens is that a result of this internationalism, you see the collision of two forces. One force being anti-imperialism, and the other force being anti-communism. Anti-communism being the secular religion of the US ruling class, and to the extent that the ruling ideas of any society are those of the ruling class, it trickled down into the middle class, into the working class. So there was a very powerful and potent anti-communist movement. The liberation movements, as noted, were receiving aid unashamedly, proudly from socialist Cuba. In the case of ZAPU from the Soviet Union, in the case of ZANU from China, for example. And this did not necessarily win them friends in Washington or on Wall Street. And as you noted, a turning point with regard to this entire struggle comes in 1974 April 25th, 1974, to be precise, with the culmination of the Portuguese Revolution. Portugal had been a colonizing power in Africa, not only in Mozambique and Angola, but also Guinea-Bissau, for example. And with the coming to power of revolutionaries in Lisboa or Lisbon, you saw an attempt to settle these conflicts, which leads to Mozambique independence in June 1975, Angolan independence in November 1975, and then the aforementioned abortive attempts by apartheid South Africa and the US CIA to overthrow Angolan independence, which does not succeed, and then sets the stage for Zimbabwean independence in April 1980, where, by the way, Bob Marley performs. You might recall that the late Jamaican megastar, one of his most popular tunes, salutes the events in Zimbabwe, for example, which he performed at the time of independence. If I'm not mistaken, that's how my book begins, with the Bob Marley performance.
Yes, absolutely.
So this was a smashing victory on behalf of our movement. And I hope I'm not getting ahead of the story if I go beyond 1980 before I go beyond 1980, to return to the thread of European solidarity. Johnson, Kissinger, Ian Smith, familial ties. I should also mention that the accused assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., speaking of James Earl Ray, Martin Luther King Jr., the U.S. human rights leader, Black American civil rights leader, assassinated April 4th, 1968. James Earl Ray is accused of shooting him. He then flees, and he was headed, first of all, to pre-revolutionary Portugal, and then to Zimbabwe or Rhodesia. That was going to be his goal. But alas, he was captured while on the lam and was returned to stand trial. And I issue these qualifiers because it's not clear if James Earl Ray acted alone, number one, or if there were larger malevolent forces that were involved in the conspiracy to kill Dr. King, with James Earl Ray just being a fall guy. But in any case, to return to the point where I interrupted myself, post-1980, you see that the Zimbabwean regime, they support the liberation movements in Namibia, coming to independence in 1990, and South Africa, coming to independence in 1994. Post-1994, after that deck is cleared, they move to the domestic business at hand, which is land reform, because the European invaders have seized a good deal of the property. And what happens is that this does not go down very well in the North Atlantic community, particularly London and Washington. They slap stiff sanctions on Zimbabwe, seeking to drive the economy into the ditch, and to an extent they succeed. I mean, you could go to a bar in Harare after sanctions were imposed, and you could order a beer for maybe, and I kid you not, $1 trillion in Zimbabwe currency. And by the time it came for you to pay the bill, because of inflation, it'd be $2 trillion. I mean, that's how ludicrous and absurd the situation was, in an attempt to strangle this regime because of their attempt to take back the land. So much pressure was created that eventually Robert Mugabe was driven out of power. Emerson Mnangagwa, the current leader, took his place. And that's where we stand today.
Yeah, and I think there was, if I'm not mistaken, recently there was a law that was enacted by the Zimbabwean parliament to compensate some of the people, some of the farmers who were confiscated, whose land was confiscated during Mugabe's rule. I know this is something that we've discussed a few months ago on the Around the Horn, which is one of the shows that I mentioned in the introduction. But if I'm mistaken, the government has implemented some policies in order to compensate some of the people who've been whose land has been confiscated during Mugabe's rule.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of pressure on the Zimbabwe regime. And in a sense, to put it simplistically and crudely, but not inaccurately, the European invaders have received a form of reparations, basically. I mean, I can guarantee you that this was not a voluntary and willing concession by the regime. They felt that they had to do this in order to survive. And this underscores something I've been talking about quite a bit, and I'll mention here as well, which is that in September 2025, there will be an important meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the first face-to-face summit between leaders of the African Union, which is headquartered in Ethiopia, and leaders of the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc. And already their relations are proceeding apace, but you should know that a major item on the agenda will be reparations, because so many African states suffered from the unlimited African slave trade. So many Africans have suffered from the ravages of the enslavement process. I would imagine that at this summit, there will be observers from Cuba, for example, from other allies and friends and comrades, for example. So it's an important gathering. And even though Black Americans are not formally invited because we do not enjoy sovereignty, there will be a Black American delegation. And I would hope and imagine that there will be a delegation from France as well, particularly from Marseille, but perhaps from every point of that Western European nation.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder, Dr. Horne. Yeah, hopefully there will be a delegation from France. I don't know if I'll be part of it, but definitely the comrades will be.
I see.
Should make every endeavor to attend it. It's very historically and politically important summit. Now I'd like to turn to a topic that we have mentioned previously, which is how the mercenaries who flocked by the thousands to southern Africa in Zimbabwe precisely helped perpetrate the white supremacist rule. So in the book you write, and I quote, "The mercenaries who began flowing into this region should not be viewed as a sideshow or as merely peripheral to the conflict in Rhodesia. They were central. It is doubtful whether the war would have lasted as long as it did without their participation. U.S. foreign policy often has used two tracks, one covert, the other one overt, and mercenaries should be seen as a rudimentary element of the former. Mercenaries was an essential component of the kind of coercive diplomacy that was used against the liberation movements. Minimally, U.S. mercenaries fought in Rhodesia with at least the tacit acquiescence of Washington." But you also talk about non-U.S. mercenaries such as Bob Denard. French mercenaries like Bob Denard had made a career out of fleeing from one African hotspot to another, toppling some regimes and fortifying others. At one time, Denard commanded a private army of 1,200 hailing from 21 different nations, and intermittently was de facto ruler in the Comoros. During the UDI era, he was closely allied with Salisbury in his attempted January 1977 coup against Benin. Rhodesia provided his aircraft. So my question is, could you explain what the main motivations of those mercenaries were? Because in the book you do talk about how many of those mercenaries have basically broken lives. Okay, as some of them were deployed in Vietnam, some of them had personal problems back home. So what were the personal motivations. You also talk about the benefits, the financial benefits they were getting from that engagement. So, what were their motivations, and how their involvement impacted the war?
Well, of course, material gain is a major impulse. That is to say, they were paid handsome salaries to fight in Rhodesia. I should also mention anti-communism, for example. That was a motivating factor. Racism and white supremacy are motivating factors. And I'm glad you reminded me about Bob Dinar, because that allows me to make a point about what could be called a permanent organized body of mercenaries, speaking of the so-called French Foreign Legion. As a matter of fact, if you have not seen it, and if you can stand it, you should see some of the Hollywood films glorifying the French Foreign Legion, particularly Beaugeste, Beaugeste. It glorifies these mercenaries who have wreaked so much havoc in Africa in particular. And they had a reputation for attracting lumpen elements, thugs, gangsters, cutthroats, for example, people with psychological problems, for example. These are the people who would flock to fight and oftentimes die in Rhodesia. And with regard to this two-track foreign policy, it's something that's still in play. That's really the hallmark of U.S. imperialism's foreign policy. And it was particularly prevalent. Oh, Beaugeste, yes. As a matter of fact, there have been about 2 or 3 versions of this same movie, for example, to show you how Hollywood was trying to glorify the French Foreign Legion, for example. But, which is, well, coercive diplomacy was particularly utilized against Mozambique post-independence. You may recall that Samora Machel, the first leader of independent Mozambique, he was killed under very mysterious circumstances. That is to say, his plane, as he was about to land in Mozambique, the controls of the plane were taken over by apartheid authorities in South Africa, and the plane was directed into a mountain, and he died. I talk about that in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, for example. At the same time, the U.S. right wing was supporting terrorists, there's no other word to use, who specialized in cutting off noses and cutting off lips of Mozambican peasants, terrorizing the population. And ultimately, that led to the so-called Nkomati Accord, Nkomati, which involves a pact between apartheid South Africa and Mozambique to expel ANC militants, for example. It was a real setback that comes during the latter stages of Samora Machel's rule. But at the same time, the U.S. had an embassy in Mozambique. Were engaged in day-to-day diplomatic niceties with the Maputo government. And so the relationship was operating on 2 tracks, for example. And, you still see the same thing. I think about this quite a bit when I think about U.S. relations with China, for example, because in 2025, Mr. Trump is negotiating to do a deal with China and to travel to China. At the same time, they're trying to overthrow the regime. I mean, so the relationship operates basically on 2 tracks, for example. And with regard to Cuba, it's basically a 1-track policy because the diplomatic relationship is rather frosty, to put it mildly. But at the same time, there is an intersection in Havana with U.S. diplomats stationed there, conducting limited business. And at the same time, the U.S. is trying to overthrow the Cuban government. And so I would say, in particular to African countries and Caribbean countries, do not be seduced by the fact that diplomatic niceties are conducted in your capital, because I can guarantee you that there are other more malignant trends being executed at the same time. I'm reading a new book about the Central Intelligence Agency, and even though the author is by Tim Weiner, Weiner, the book is called The Mission, and he does not stress this. But reading this book, one thing is clear, is that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency seeks to recruit the intelligence agencies of other countries, basically. I mean, with suitcases full of cash, suitcases full of $100 bills. That's their favorite tactic. Going through this book, it's difficult for me to remember all of these heads of intelligence in all these different countries who are on the CIA payroll. It's really quite shocking.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Horne. So you said the title of the book is The Mission, right?
By Tim Weiner, Weiner.
Right.
I'm reading it now. He's a stenographer for the CIA, basically, which means that you can't accept everything you read, because I'm sure you recall Julian Assange,
Yes.
the Australian guy who leaks all these U.S. intelligence secrets. He basically argues that Julian Assange was an agent of Moscow, which I don't accept. But that's an indication of how you have to read a book like this very cautiously. But for those who are truly interested in anti-imperialism, I would recommend it.
All right. Thank you. Well noted. I know we're running out of time. I only have about 10 minutes, but there are two very important questions that I wanted to ask you. The first one on the limitations of white supremacy in Rhodesia and how it led to the defeat of Salisbury, and also the involvement of the African Americans and their engagement with the liberation movement in Zimbabwe. So regarding the failure of the regime in Rhodesia to bring about a cohesive, unified white community, you're right, the very presence of ostensibly white, quote, white US mercenaries, Jewish and Gentile, and of Western and Eastern European origins was a living reminder of how ethnic and ethno-religious differences could be submerged in the reinvention that was whiteness, quote, whiteness, unquote. The Rhodesians, however, were not successful in emulating this model. Instead, they were nagged by conflicts between and among Britain and Boer and Portuguese, not to mention religious differences. Indeed, other than the fierce will and determination of the Africans themselves, the inability to construct a viable whiteness by assuaging conflict between and among Europeans was probably the single most important reason for the defeat of Rhodesia. So my question is, I guess it's a broad question that we might not have enough time to deal with today. So my question is, why were other settler colonial regimes able to overcome those ethnic differences among whites? Was it because many of the white settlers, as you mentioned, had migrated to Rhodesia only a few decades before the war broke out?
Yeah, that's a reason. They had shallow roots. But it's deeper than that. I think I stress this in my book on Southern Africa, which largely deals with South Africa. This inability to construct a viable whiteness is a contributing factor in the defeat of the apartheid regime. To cite one example, for example, the Afrikaners were violently anti-Jewish, for example. And so you had Jewish settlers who were streaming into South Africa, particularly at the end of the 19th century, fleeing pogroms in what is now Romania, Moldova, even Russia, for example. But once arriving in South Africa, they were not necessarily welcomed into a white community, so-called. They were subjected to bigotry. It's no accident that some of leading anti-apartheid activists, Joe Slovo, who was at one time head of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress. He's of Lithuanian Jewish descent. His spouse, Ruth First, killed by a letter bomb in Mozambique in the 1980s, also of Jewish descent, for example. Running Casseroles, you might be familiar with his book, Armed and Dangerous, an ANC militant of Jewish descent. And so this was a contradiction that the Afrikaners could not surmount. And then there's the Portuguese, because the Portuguese are ruling in neighboring Mozambique, ruling in neighboring Angola. But oftentimes, not only in South Africa, but also I would say the United States of America, they were viewed as not quite white, for example. I'm publishing a book in a few months on Hawaii, and there was a substantial Portuguese population in Hawaii. But as you probably know, beginning in the 1400s, there have been close relationships between Portugal and Africa. And as an inevitable result, a number of people in Portugal were rather bronzed, as they say. They had a touch of the tar brush, as used to be said in the United States of America. In other words, they had melanin content. And despite their protestations, they were not necessarily welcomed or embraced as being white, just because of the way they looked. And so what's striking about this is that you would think that these minority regimes were outnumbered, sometimes 20-1, that they would accept any and all comers, but they were too mule-headed and too obstinate to do so. And that ultimately helps to explain their defeat. And you see the same thing in the United States of America. That is to say, you have this Hispanic category, and all of those who are incorporated in that category, even though some of them are, from a phenotypical point of view, quote, white, unquote, they're not necessarily accepted into that community. I mean, look at the way they're being rounded up in Los Angeles as we speak. As a matter of fact, one of the markers that leads to your being grabbed by the authorities on the street is speaking Spanish, for example. If you're speaking Spanish fluently on the streets of Los Angeles, you can be grabbed by a masked man, thrown into a truck. The next thing you know, you're in Mexico City. I mean, it's at least you can say with regard to U.S. imperialism that those defined as white are not necessarily outnumbered. And so therefore, I guess that helps to shed light upon these roughhouse tactics in Los Angeles. But how do you explain Salisbury? Is that Joe Slovo that you just put up?
That's a picture of Joe Slovo and Ruth First.
Right.
I think it was right after their trial, the treason trial, 1956.
Exactly. So in any case, this is part of the contradiction of white supremacy. And of course, our movement needs to figure out ways to exploit that contradiction.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Horne. And as a footnote, Ruth First was also born in 1925, just like Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, Patrice Lumumba, Medgar Evers, Renaud Moumier, and many other freedom fighters who, for reasons that are unknown to me, decided to be born in 1925, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So this is also an opportunity for us to pay tribute to these great freedom fighters and African leaders. So as a final question, I want you to talk about the role of African Americans, the contradictions that emerge between African Americans and some of the sections of the liberation movement, not only in Zimbabwe, but also in Southern Africa. In South Africa, South Africa, we'll probably talk about it when we discuss your book, White Supremacy Confronted. But today I wanted to, since we are talking about Zimbabwe, I wanted to talk about the engagement of African Americans with the liberation movement in Zimbabwe. So you write, and I quote in the book, that's the right quote, should be this one. Okay, so the African American struggle was evolving in a nation where anti communism was prominent, and this inevitably impacted the trajectory of their struggle. Anti communism frequently pushed the liberation forces in the nation that became Zimbabwe away from their natural allies in South Africa and elsewhere, thereby retarding the devolution of white supremacy. Put bluntly, the enforced anti-communism of the United States was not as prevalent among African Americans as it was among others, but it was certainly present. When this trend migrated across the ocean, borne by African Americans, it helped to sustain attitudes in Zimbabwe that were not helpful in overthrowing the minority regime. In particular, it hindered the ability of Zimbabweans to ally with the hegemonic political force in the region, the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela, which was in a tight and all-encompassing alliance with the South African Communist Party (SACP). And finally, you also um, uh, highlight some of the differences between African Americans and
Mhm.
Africans, which is there is a difference between struggles involving an African minority and those involving an African majority. In the latter, the ultimate goal is the control of both the state apparatus and the economy, as opposed to mere amelioration of conditions within the government and economic status quo, the trend in the former. So, based on these contradictions and these differences, and by the way, you also mentioned in the book some of the not so positive exploits, I think is the term that you use in the book, of some African Americans, for example, supporting, especially among the so called black nationalists, their support to Renamo, UNITA. It was the counter revolutionary forces that were backed by the CIA in Southern Africa. So, based on this background, my question would be, in your opinion, what are the main lessons that African Americans, not only African Americans, but Africans living in the diaspora in general, especially in the Western countries, Western imperialist countries, what are the lessons they could learn in order to shape, to have better attitudes towards anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles in the continent?
Well, first of all, a bit of context. Recall what I said a few moments ago about the process that led to the retreat of U.S. apartheid, which involved throwing overboard the Black internationalists like Paul Robeson in the first instance. And so, like a seesaw, when you weakened the internationalist forces, you strengthened the other two trends, which are Black liberalism and Black nationalism. Now, Black nationalism was heterogeneous. That is to say, even within Black nationalism, you had a kind of revolutionary Black nationalism, as exemplified by the Black Panther Party. And to put it euphemistically, you had a not so revolutionary trend as well. And this is that latter trend that supported UNITA in Angola, despite the fact that it was backed simultaneously by the White House and by the CIA, but they were seduced and taken by the idea that UNITA put forward, that it was authentically Black, that unlike the leaders of the MPLA, they did not have that many mulattoes, so-called, in their ranks, that is to say, so-called mixed race individuals. Unlike the ruling MPLA, the dominant MPLA, they said that they were not necessarily attracted to European women, for example. And this struck a chord with many of the so-called Black nationalists in the United States of America. That's on the one hand. Now let's turn to the Black liberals. They had cut a deal with the U.S. ruling class and were very close to the U.S. ruling class, particularly those within the leadership of the Democratic Party, which intermittently has ruled the United States of America, but now is on a downward spiral. And I think belatedly, there's a recognition that this deal that was cut with the Democratic Party and with the liberals was not sustainable, because now the liberals themselves are under attack. I mean, they're afraid of going to jail. So how can they can't even protect themselves? How are they going to protect Black Americans, for example? But in any case, during the height of the liberation struggle, you have many Black liberals who were seduced by anti-communism. I mean, to take one example amongst many, Bayard Rustin, Rustin, Barack Obama just produced a Hollywood film that turns him into a hero. And of course, he's viewed as a hero by many because he was more or less openly gay and was subjected to homophobia. But at the same time, he was a staunch anti-communist and therefore was hotly opposed to many of these liberation movements because they were seen as being in the pocket of Moscow or Beijing, for example. Now, of course, the Obama movie does not deal with all of these tricky contradictions, not surprisingly, of course, which is one of the reasons you don't necessarily try to learn history from a movie. But in any case, Bayard Rustin exemplifies this liberal anti-communist trend, which was not necessarily friendly to the liberation movements. And I think that both the now ruling parties in Southern Africa, ZANU-PF, because by the way, ZAPU and ZANU eventually merged, creating ZANU-PF or ZANU Patriotic Front, still ruling in Zimbabwe since 1980. ANC now in a shotgun marriage, the so-called Government of National Unity in Pretoria, with the so-called Democratic Alliance, the neo-apartheid forces. But I think that both of our struggles have been weakened as a result of the disruption in our relationship. I mean, certainly Black Americans under siege and under assault by Trump, we need all the help we can get, but we don't necessarily have the kinds of international alliances that we so desperately need. And South Africa, it's under assault. I'm sure you heard the story about what happened when President Ramaphosa was invited to the Oval Office by Mr. Trump. He basically harassed him. I mean, it was very disrespectful, among other things. Now he's just slapped 30% tariffs on South African exports. He's trying to wreck the economy. And what's interesting about the tariff war is that he's also slapped 30% tariffs on Lesotho, the independent African nation, which is heavily dependent on South Africa. Only 15% on Zimbabwe and Namibia, for example. So he really is going after South Africa desperately because he recognizes South Africa as the hub of not only the sub-regional economy, but the African economy to a certain extent. South Africans have major investments in Nigeria, for example. And so the South Africans need our solidarity. We need Southern African solidarity. But unfortunately, the relationship has withered for various reasons. But alas, all is not lost because in September 2025, at the Addis Ababa Summit of leaders of the African Union and CARICOM, hopefully we'll be able to resuscitate and revive these relationships that are mutually beneficial.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. I guess these are all the questions I had for you today. So is there any update on your work or an event that you, for example, the event that you participated in recently, I think it was a support to the Cuban Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
I know the video is online, but maybe there are some of the updates that you wanted to share.
Well, yeah, that's online. I spoke in Vancouver about 8 days ago, Vancouver, British Columbia, in a solidarity meeting on solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, and it's online. I recommend it. I also just gave, I was on this podcast, India and the Global Left, where I expanded upon some of these ideological questions that are bedeviling our movement here in North America, and I recommend that as well. Not to mention my new book, The Capital of Slavery, which, as you mentioned, has just dropped. And my next book will be on Asia and the Pacific, Hawaii, the attempt by the independent Hawaii to organize the entire Pacific region, Samoa, Guam, Marianas Islands, etc., and how that was thwarted by U.S. imperialism, which overthrew the regime and then incorporated Hawaii as the 50th and final state, unless Mr. Trump's dream of incorporating Canada as the 51st state somehow comes into fruition.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. Just for to our audience, so the interview that you just made reference to is on the YouTube channel of India and the Global Left. You can also find other excellent interviews that Dr. Horne conducted with our comrades, including one on the so-called American Revolution, which is a counter-revolution title that we'll be discussing soon. So once again, would like to thank Dr. Horne for taking the time to come on the show and for sharing so much knowledge that will hopefully shape our engagement with anti-colonial forces globally, and also encourage some of our members of our audience to attend the very important summit that will take place in September. What's the date again?
I think it's September 7th, but
September 7th.
Check online.
Yeah, we'll check that online. September 7th this year, 2025 in Addis Ababa. So Dr. Horne, thank you very much. And we're looking forward to having you soon on Amandla.
Right on. Good luck to you. Hey, be sure to send me the link.
Yeah, well, I will do it. Definitely, I will send you the link.
Oftentimes, those who are beaten are not necessarily participants in the demonstration. And one of the latter, that is to say, a passerby who is beaten by the police, tells the cop, "Look, don't beat me. I'm an anti-communist." And the cop responds, "I don't care what kind of communist you are. You're still going to get beaten." The problem in the North Atlantic camp is that we're a distinct minority. And so even if we are able to put forward a progressive and historically sustainable line, that does not necessarily mean that it will carry the day, unless and until we are able to connect our progressive and historically sustainable line to a mass movement globally. In 1776, there were thousands of Africans in the newly minted United States of America. By 1860, there were millions. And so if we're to accept that the 1776 was a great leap forward for humanity, we're also saying that it was a great leap forward for our ancestors to be enslaved. I'm very concerned in 2025 that Black Americans could easily be swept up into this anti-China, anti-Asian hysteria, anti-Russian hysteria, because of a failure to understand the importance of internationalism in our struggle. I think that one of the lessons of history that we should extract is that even though it may be difficult, and I should underline difficult, it may be difficult to be principled in the midst of swirling controversy. It may be difficult to be principled when you feel that you can gain a cafe that was once owned by a Japanese American, or a truck farm once owned by a Japanese American, and therefore improve the lot of your own family, not to mention yourself. At the end of the day, I think we must stand up on principle, and we must reject opportunism. But alas, that is easier said than done.